Bonjour class, today we're learning the first of two different types of object pronouns. This first one that we're learning today is called an indirect object pronoun. So to start off today's lesson, we'll talk about what that means, what an indirect object is, what an indirect object pronoun is, what they are in French, how we use them in a sentence, as well as verbs that are commonly used with indirect object pronouns. So to start off, we need to know what this means in English so that you understand me when I'm talking about it in French. An indirect object describes to whom or for whom an action is done. It's almost always a person. It says always here. Be careful, there's always exceptions, but pretty much almost always it will refer to a person. An example, she speaks to her mother. In this case, her mother is the indirect object because that is to whom the action of speaking is being done. He sends letters to his girlfriend, same thing, sending to his girlfriend. I sent an email to you. You is the indirect object because that is to whom the email is being sent. And the teacher showed the students the correct answers. The students is the indirect object. We're used to by now, in these three examples, we saw it was at the end of the sentence. But here it's not necessarily the end of the sentence, it's just to whom it is being shown. So an indirect object pronoun replaces a noun. You probably use these all the time without even realizing it. So in this case, an indirect object pronoun replaces an indirect object. These can be used to make a shorter sentence, but only if we already know who we're talking about. Otherwise, it just gets really confusing. So if we look at our examples from the last slide, she speaks to her mother. We could just replace her mother and say she speaks to her. Her is an indirect object pronoun in English. We also have he sends letters to his girlfriend. Same thing, we could get rid of that and say he sends letters to her. I sent an email to you. In this case, I sent you an email. And the teacher showed the students the correct answers. The teacher showed them the correct answers. So in each case, we can get rid of the indirect object if we have one of these indirect object pronouns like her, you, or them. And it's the same thing in French, we just need to learn the vocabulary for it first or else it won't work. So if you're replacing me, you replace it with me, pronounced very differently, but spelled the same. If you're using you in the singular or familiar, it's te. Him or her is lui. Us is nous. You, plural or formal, is vous, and them is leur. I know that we're used to seeing nous and vous as subjects, like we or you, but it can also be used as the indirect object pronoun. So sometimes you may even see it twice in a row. I know it looks weird, but it might be correct. So to use these in a sentence, it's a very similar process to what we talked about in English, but in French, the indirect object pronoun always goes before the verb. And go ahead and circle that in your notes so that I know that you're paying attention to what I say. She speaks to her mother, so we want to start off by translating it into French before we try to simplify it. We just want to translate this fully, and that would be elle parle à sa mère. And then once again, sa mère, that is the indirect object because that is to whom elle parle, to whom she speaks. So we would replace that for the one that means her. So then we have elle lui parle, she speaks to her. Our second example, he sends letters to his girlfriend. Elle envoie des lettres à sa petite amie. Once again, sa petite amie is going to be the indirect object, so we will replace it with the indirect object pronoun, which again is lui. Lui means her. Il lui envoie des lettres. I sent you an email. J'ai envoyé un email à toi. We replace toi or you with te, but in this case we're going to form a contraction. So it's not je te ai, it's je t'ai envoyé. And finally, the teacher showed the students the correct answers. Le prof a montré les bonnes réponses aux étudiants. We would get rid of étudiant, and then it becomes le prof a montré les bonnes réponses. The teacher showed them. The tricky thing about French is that in English, we always put the indirect object pronoun after the verb, right? He showed them. But here it's he, them showed. So the order is a little bit different, so it will not translate directly, so we just need to get used to seeing it like this in French. And then lastly, there are some verbs that almost always use an indirect object pronoun if you are using a pronoun. And so it's helpful just to know these so that when you see them, you can recognize an opportunity for an indirect object pronoun. First is demander à, then we have donner à, envoyer à, montrer à, parler à, poser une question à, prêter à. We want to make sure that we have all of these in our notes, as well as téléphoner à. That last one should hopefully be familiar. Make sure that you have all of the definitions for these as well. Et ça, c'est tout.